democratic institutions to promote inclusive, accountable and participatory governance. He stated that it is a fight that, if it succeeds, will bring progress and prosperity to the African continent, stressing that military interventions and regimes were not the solution to the continent's plethora of challenges. While Afrobarometer surveys show that 2/3 of Africans prefer democracy over other forms of government, the support seems to be waning within the continent of Africa. It adds that over half of Africa's population are now willing to accept military takeovers if civilian leaders are perceived to abuse their power. As of now, African countries on the military takeover stands to be Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Guinea, Conakry, Chad, Gabon and Sudan. What are the analysis as far as this latest statement made by the Ghanaian president is concerned, ladies and gentlemen? We shall be unpacking that in the course of today's edition of Talking Points, and more. Stay with us. The world, thank you for trusting your Pan-African channel for you Media Africa. Like the the Ghanaian president stated recently, democracy has more opportunities as opposed to military takeovers within the African continent. He made this statement lately in Accra, Ghana, while talking about the sprout of military takeovers that have emerged across the West African country. And of course, to evoke this statement made by the West African president, we shall be discussing this day with Chief MUSI, who is a Pan-Africanist, joining us all the way here from Cameroon. Thank you immensely, sir, for taking our time to be with us.
Return rather than a governing body. Exactly.
Chief MUSI, you're welcome on board.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Thank you for always having us on For You Media, and always glad to be with my co-panelists.
It's a pleasure to have you here, Your Royal Highness. Meanwhile, all the way from the United States, we're being joined by Dr. Stanley FONGOD, who is a Pan-Africanist, an economist, and the CEO of CROSTON FINTECH. Thank you immensely, sir, for taking our time to be with us this day.
Thank you, Sharon, for having me, and thank my co-panelist, Chief, for joining as well.
It's a pleasure to have you both on board. Like we mentioned in our preamble today, we focus on issues that are peculiar to the African continent, which is in between democracy and military takeovers. The Ghanaian president states that democracy has more gains, has more opportunities within the continent of Africa. He added that democracy has, if it is a fight that had to be waged on the African continent, democracy would win as it has more opportunities. I would kickstart with you, Chief MUSI. As far as today's topic of discussion is concerned, what is your take on this issue of democracy and military takeovers, which we have seen over a couple of years within the continent of Africa?
First, I would want to say that this is a topic that we have always tried to look at the level of the Pan-African Union, but I still have a feeling that most of the things that are happening in Africa is because most of the leaders in Africa have actually abused the role of democracy. And because they've abused the role of democracy, we are caught up with numerous military takeovers across Africa. I would be saying so because before now, when most of the African countries had their independence, democracy was an issue of the colonial masters. They had to kind of educate the countries that they were actually ruling over. They had to educate them about the value and the role of democracy in choosing their leaders. And democracy in the rightful African sense, it's actually the rule of the majority, the rule of the civilian. It is the right of members of a state to take decisions with a majority of their population. All this through elected representatives. And if we look at this and look at how Africa was before and what Africa has become today, we will be caught up with every other reason to be given to a positive side to the numerous military rule or military takeovers that has been happening across Africa. And for that reason, I think if we have to dive into this topic of today, what President Akufo-Addo said was just reiterating why democracy should exist, and he then looked at the back face of why democracy has been abused. Okay, take a simple example. Well, across Africa, leaders forcefully get themselves into government without actually getting the right of the people. What I'm saying is election rigging, the fact that the governments in power do not take the decisions arrived at by election monitors or put in the United Nations, which I put in quote, they really do not take the decisions where that it's usually brought up after electoral processes within Africa. So Africa, because it was colonized by most of the European countries, they now tend to steal what we have in Africa, and by so doing, they impose on the population, they impose on the civilians who are the benefactors of democracy. They impose on them leaders for their selfish interests. I think that is the reason why Africa today has lots of military coups. We will be diagnosing this in the course of the program, but it's important to take sight with Akufo to say, yes, there is a need for democracy, but is this democracy being practiced in Africa?
Thank you so much, Chief MUSI. Like you mentioned, democracy is waning within the continent of Africa. Now to you, Dr. FONGOD, you listen to your co-panelists, and just in that regard, at some point, Chief MUSI stated that while President Akufo-Addo was stating this, he did not highlight some of the reasons why democracy is actually going down or gaining unpopularity within the continent of Africa. In your own perspective, as a Pan-Africanist, at what point did democracy begin to wane within the continent of Africa, given that we've seen many military takeovers recently within the West African sub-region?
Well, I think that it's quite important for us to understand that irrespective of whatever is happening, the African is looking for the outcome. The African is trying to figure out what works best for the African. And if you look in many of these countries where there are coups, most of those in those countries are not complaining about the form of leadership that they do have now. Despite the fact that they are under this military rule, they enjoy it more than when it was civilian rule. Reasons being, when civilian rule has failed in being able to meet up with the needs of the people, when civilian rule cannot be able to bring infrastructural development, when civilian rule has no place in being able to help the people in relationship to their own life expectancy, good hospitals, educational facilities, and actually have a vision for the future, then the people have no other choice but to turn to whatever works. And right now, if you look at those three nations in the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, they are doing a whole lot better than previously when they were under a democratic rule. So if you're looking at that from that perspective, most Africans will tell you whether they prefer, based upon some demographic the questionnaire as to whether they prefer a democratic institution or democracy over any kind of military rule, they will tell you that they will want something that works. I think most democracies or most countries on the continent of Africa that has been run by democracies, we should be able to now say definitively at this particular point in time that if you're going to do a survey with those people in those countries, they will tell you they want something that works. And when you look at places like Niger, look at places like Burkina Faso, look at places like Mali, and you ask yourself, which is better? Is this post or is it post the colonial system, post the democratic system that they had, or is it now that things are basically the way they are with the military rule? They will tell you they probably prefer the military rule. So I think we have to look a little bit further in trying to find out what works for us as Africans, and also dive into this whole entire issues about democracy. Do we need democracy on the African continent, or we don't need democracy on the African continent? Democracy is a Western construct, and if that Western construct works for the West, and the reason why it works for the West is because of the structures of the West. So if you're going to bring that structure from the Western ways of thinking into the African context, we must find out what is it about that system that mirror images us on the African continent. And if there are issues with that particular system on the African continent, then we must be able to start working out maybe a hybrid system on the African continent that is good for us as a people. But you cannot just bring something, import something from the West, and then bring it onto into Africa, and then think that is absolutely going to work and help us as a people. And if the idea that democracy is supposed to bring development, if the idea that democracy is supposed to somehow be able to help us grow as a people, the reality is that if you look at countries like Russia, if you look at countries like China, well, they have very limited democracy. It's not a liberal democracy. It's actually, it's more of a Marxist system. But that particular regions like China and Russia, they are doing quite well economically, even though there's some kind of minimum freedom so far as the people are concerned. But we need to be able to find out if we can be able to have some kind of a hybrid system on the continent of Africa where there is freedom, there's liberty, but at the same time, whatever form of democracy that we have should be able to meet up with our cultures, our values, and and whatever our norms are.
Thank you so much, Dr. FONGOD. I'll stay with you, giving your side to something. Of course, we're coming back to which system actually suits best the African continent. But before I get leave of you, listen, you mentioned something. Of course, the Ghanaian president had cited that it's imperative for African countries to invest into institutions, democratic institutions within the continent. In that regard, I remember some time ago, pundits were of the opinion that Africa needed strong institutions and not strong individuals. Do you share the same opinion?
Yes, we do. But the problem with that idea on the continent of Africa, especially when we start talking about, having some kind of a liberal democracy on the continent of Africa, is the fact that you need to start talking about some kind of a political pluralism where you have many political parties. The problem is when we do have many political parties on the continent of Africa, it's actually a setup rather than something that can actually help the people. For example, if you have a country where there's supposed to be an election and you have 200 political parties participating in that election, that is a fraud. So in that way, the reality is that whoever is in power stays in power. That is why these things are structured that way. So if you're going to talk about political pluralism in a legitimate democracy, it has to be something that is well managed, maybe 3-4 political parties. That is a managed, and a well understood scenario. We talk about separation of powers in a democracy. I don't understand how we have separation of powers on the African continent when all the democracies that we have, whoever is in power owns those who have been elected from the different regions to do some kind of a representation in the parliament, in the Congress, whichever country that you come from. And then the judiciary also is basically in the hands of whoever is in power, and the military is also in the hands of whoever is in power. So in that way, there's no separation of powers, and so it's difficult for us to start talking about having a democracy on the continent when this has not been, what we are known for. The rule of law, of course, once the judiciary is not in place, there is no rule of law, and individual rights and protection of freedom of speech is absolutely out the window, because you can't say anything to anyone who is in power, because these folks basically will let you know that they are in charge and they're in control. So it's difficult for us on the continent to start talking about just diving in to talk about creating repose democratic institutions. Whatever it's called democratic institutions is good when it comes to the Western world. The West actually, which is basically not even a democracy, as you know, we keep saying that, you know, as we say America, which is basically pushing this thing down everybody's throat, is a democracy. It's not a democracy. America is a constitutional republic, which is very different from a democracy. If America was a democracy, we will have trouble and chaos every single day on the streets of America. But they are not, but yet they are pushing this whole entire idea of democracy on us on the African continent. The premise for the idea of democracy is great, but I think there has to be a system that works for us as Africans, not something that is just being pushed to us. We must be able to look at this a little bit differently, have some kind of a representation from, you know, from our cultural background, from our chiefs, and which is basically the same thing that happens when we elect people to send out to Yaoundé or to Asherok. These are folks who get into power. They come in as a representation, either be it senators and whatnot. So it'll be the same thing, but this time around we are having our local chiefs, we're having our elders that will participate because of our ethnic nature. We have so many tribes and we are loyal to our people. We are loyal to our tribes, and that is the way it's supposed to be because of who we are as a people. We cannot ignore that. Ignoring that in the name of superimposing an artificial level of management across a country without taking into account our chiefs, without taking into account our royal leaders, it's, you know, it's absolutely not going to work. It has not worked anywhere, and that's the reason why the continent is the way it is. We must change strategy and find ways in which we can have a hybrid system, develop a system that fits us as Africans, not something that is superimposed from the West.
Thank you so much, Dr. FONGOD. Now proceeding with you, Chief MUSI, you listen to Dr. FONGOD, who stated that democracy might work well for some countries, but in other scenarios, it is not the case. Meanwhile, President Akufo-Addo had stated that democracy does have a lot of opportunities, has a lot of gains as far as taking the African continent forward in terms of progress and prosperity is concerned. In that same light, are you of the same school of thought as the Ghanaian president, given you mentioned earlier that he fell short of highlighting some of the limitations of democracy within the continent of Africa? We've seen in West Africa where we saw countries that underwent military coups that were slammed with sanctions. We're speaking of the countries of the Alliance of Sahel states, which actually led them to forming their own confederation. So do you actually share some opinion that democracy does indeed have many opportunities as opposed to military rule?
First, I would take it from where Dr. FONGOD ended by saying that the reason why we still keep having the poor practice of democracy in Africa is because of the fact that our institutions are weak. And once we have weak institutions and widespread corruption, it leads to the military coming in to take over. And if you ask, I would be supporting President Akufo-Addo in the sense that if democracy was rightly practiced in its rightful sense, as to the role of the civilians, the rights to the civilians, the role of majority, if all of this was being practiced in Africa, I would give my support to President Akufo to say we should prioritize. But for how long do we keep saying we should prioritize democracy over military rule in Africa? We have highlighted, and like you heard Dr. FONGOD mention, we have highlighted lots and lots of instances in Africa where our African masses are comfortable with the military coups and the military takeover in most of the countries which were highlighted as an example. And it doesn't end there. There are many more other African countries where the population keeps rising against governments. And rising against governments means they are not satisfied with the role of governance. Why? If you heard Dr. Mengod mentioned a handful of different departments like the judiciary, the military, finance, and all of it. These are institutions that are placed under the ruling government, like it's done all over Africa. It's true. Before, in 20, 30 years ago, we could have been talking about democracy in America, but we misunderstood the rule, the constitutional law in America to mean democracy. Because if we watch the last 3 presidential elections, in America, you would understand that America is not practicing democracy. They only have a strong constitution. Meanwhile, African constitutions are weak. So let President Akufo not misquote the rule of the use of constitution in our different government systems within continents to mean democracy, because democracy is still not practiced in its rightful sense anywhere across the world. I want to be very honest about this. Instead, institutions and governments are having good constitutions that they use to impose or to prove to the outside world that they have good democratic practices. Let me look at it again this way. If you look at systems of governments that are weak, it is because all these different sectors, like we mentioned, the judiciary, the finance, the military, all of them are under the government. But if in most of the governments, we made it in a way that even if you are in the ruling, if you are the president, opposition organs can still have the majority in parliament, like it's practiced, like should be the rightful sense. And then at a certain point, you will realize that president will have to work under a certain degree of pressure, because the masses who will occupy maybe most of the seats in parliament or in the Senate will be able to impose some of the rules over government. I take a simple example within my traditional council. Being the fund and being the representative of my people, I wasn't elected. But it's a right that I inherit from my forefathers, but it doesn't give me the right to be able to decide over the people, because I have a strong traditional setup, a traditional council which involves most of the other key families within my fandom. And when certain decisions are being taken within my fandom, the traditional council sits down, looks at some of these decisions, deliberate upon them, and make proposals to me as the head of the clan or the head of the village to be able to look at these proposals before we take a final decision together with them. But this is not what is being practiced in our government systems. So I think what we are saying here is that in as much as we know what democracy rightly means, Akufo should start showing his own example in Ghana. I heard his speech that he's recently presented at the UN, at the United Nations, but I think he was saying that he's soon getting to the end of his mandate after 8 years of serving. He's soon getting to the end of his mandate, and he expects that they should, African countries should practice democracy. Yes, this is always what they are saying. When they realize that they are having strong resistance, opposition resistance, when they realize that their tenure of office is getting to an end, when they realize that they can no longer change the constitution, what they do is they start accepting the role of democracy by preparing some other person to take over, which that person comes again and tells the constitution to suit their individual gains. And all of these is as a result of our colonial masters, who are the West, who have imposed so much on us to the extent that we can no longer bear. I even heard Akufo said in his speech at the UN recently that that the Ghanaian government it's investing more into agriculture. Yes, you can see they are investing into agriculture, but if you look at the amount of mechanical machines that have gotten into Ghana to support his idea of agriculture, you will start asking the questions, where are these machines from? The next thing you would hear is these machines are coming from the West. These machines are coming from people who are supporting their governments or supporting their systems of governance. So at this level, I think we should give peace a chance for the civilians who are the benefactors of democracy, and at the same time the benefactors of military rule, to take decisions or to take to what favors them, especially in accepting what is best for them. There are differences with military rule. I would be, maybe when I come up again, I'll have to tell you some of the challenges with the military regime, and also how most of these military rulers who have taken over in Africa have turned these challenges into successes, and the population have turned to it. And if other military rulers have to come up in Africa, they have to take Burkina Faso as an example, and the alliance that is existing within that region as a perfect example for a good military rule. We are not saying it's the best, because the rule of the gun is not the best, but I think it is important to take and understand what the masses like best. Thank you.
Thank you to Your Highness. But to stay with you, you cited that the military regime does have numerous challenges, which I'd like you to coin in this question I'm about to ask. Now, we look at Ghana. Ghana is one of those countries which we could term as one of the most democratic nations on the African continent. Why do I say this? I am linking this up with what the President Akufo-Addo said. But we recall when, back in the days when Ghana went through a military transition under J.J. Rawlings, you saw the country moved from a military rule, what was called a coup, to a democratic country. Now, with that in mind, do you believe that it's with that ideology that President Addo is coming in now at this particular point in time when his tenure is about to end? Because you know that Ghana is going to host elections come December this year. Could this be in line with what had happened to the country in the past, transitioning the country to where it is now? And what are some of those challenges which the military rule within the continent of Africa gets to face?
Well, let me agree with President Akufo in the sense that most of the world, or most of most of the countries in Africa sees Ghana as one of the best countries that is practicing democracy. True. And for his number of years being at the helm of the Ghanaian presidency, he has proven himself. And if you heard his last outings, he has proven that he wants strong and good democratic institutions in Ghana. But let me say here that in as much as he is reassuring the population, and in as much as he is going out, he should prove what he is saying when he leaves power by setting in place a perfect democracy for Ghana, which has not only limitations, but it has a continuity. Because it will be out of place for him to leave power, organize free and fair elections, have new persons come in, and then the next thing is we start having military coups. It still means that people were only comfortable not about the democratic values, but they were comfortable about the person who was institutionalizing that democracy, looking at him as a person, as a Akufo, but not the democratic stance that he stands to protect. Now, let me come back to some of the challenges that the military really has. It is important to understand that when military takes over, they pipe down chaos. When military takes over, they provide quick and decisive actions that will restore the role of stability. The military, in another sense, are well-trained persons in order to take tough decisions that prioritize the safety of the civilians. So if you look at the case of what is happening in most of the African countries, you will realize that this same military is an arm of governments. It's an arm of governments, and most governments enshrine their powers on the military because they know that once the military turns against the government, it's done and dusted for the system. So if you look across Africa, the military being one of the strongest arm of government and institutions of democracy, they are trained to protect the safety of the state, to protect the safety of the civilians. So if the rightful military person takes over, there is a higher probability that in respect of the constitution, these same military leaders can still push the government into more stable and realistic democratic practices. And I think that as we look at the challenges that the military role has over democracy, we cannot also minimize the fact that with military rule, there is censorship, there is a lot of censorship, there is a lot of restriction to civilian liberty, and of course, there is lack of accountability. Those are the three aspects that every military ruler that takes over sits on: censorship, restriction, civilian liberty, and the lack of accountability. So this is something that while we peruse and while we diagnose all of these issues about military rule, we should be able to challenge any military government that goes around restricting civilians from their rights and restricting censorship and not being accountable to their government. But I know that most of the military coups, they always give us time to institute more practical civilian rule with full democracy once they know that the state is stable, like the case in Burkina Faso. The president has called for election a couple of times, but the civilians still think that it's not yet time. He needs to stabilize the government. He needs to create better opportunities for the people before he organizes free and fair elections. I think that's a good example we can lean on.
Thank you, Chief MUSI. Picking up from where you stopped, I'll proceed with you, Dr. FONGOD. Now, numerous pundits are of the point of view that for democracy to thrive or survive within the continent of Africa, it's crucial for states and governments to be able to restore peace and trust in government institutions, or the ability for them to be able to deliver on accountable and transparent leadership. Now, when you look at the continent of Africa, especially this context in which we find ourselves in the continent, do you believe that this is feasible?
No, I don't think it's feasible at all. And the reason for that is because we are corrupt to the core. So the whole entire structure is quite corrupt. I think when the president of Ghana speaks about the fact that we need to build democratic institutions and actually rely on them, you know, the question becomes, we have done that for the last 6 decades, and it has not worked for the African. Nothing that has come out of the West in relationship to, you know, the free market capitalist system has actually worked on the continent of Africa. It has not worked for us as a people. And so we have to start thinking about this, that whenever you talk to the African is thinking more likely in relationship to what is working for them so far as, you know, their livelihood is concerned. There is no one who sits over there to pontificate on the issues of a free capitalist market. They don't understand what that is. They could care less. There's nobody who is thinking about state control economy. Nobody cares about that. We are not thinking about how heavy-handed the government is on certain issues. People just want to be able to live in a prosperous nation, a community that is quite prosperous, where we can absolutely, as a people, you know, move out of poverty, at least push a lot of people into the middle class. That's what a lot of folks are interested in. And so if you're going to ask me where we go from here and how we're able to manage what is happening on the continent of Africa, I think we need to be able to have a hybrid system. The free capital, the free market, you know, which is basically capitalism, has worked well in the West. It has worked well for America. I think that most of the innovations that we have had has been as a result of the competition that takes place in a free market. What a free market does is it allows for people to basically compete, and the best company with the best idea, with the best technology emerges, and then, you know, the market basically appreciates them for their innovations. That's the beauty of a free market. Now, on the other hand, if you look at a country like America and you start asking yourself what's going on, they have developed all that they can develop within that particular system, but most of the products that they have developed is actually being built in a communist system out in the East. Even though China is not a fully communist society, it has a little bit of democracy or free market into it, because there are a lot of Chinese, which is basically the hybrid system I was talking about. There's a lot of Chinese that are multi-millionaires that are involved in the free market system in China, and they are building and developing most of the products that we are actually using out in the West and in Africa, to say the least. So what we need is to be able to have a system that is open, a system that is open to new ideas. We have some kind of a communist mindset in relationship to our economy, and we also have a free market system enshrined into whatever it is that we come out with. Because if you look at the successes that has taken place in China, you will realize that the gains has been made as a relationship of the fact that you have people who come into power with a long-term strategy, with a long-term goal, and their goal is to be able to push the nation forward, irrespective of which political party that you belong in. It doesn't matter to them. I think you've heard about the story of the Great Chinese War, when I think it took them, it was a 100-year project. Can you imagine? A century. It took 100 years. It was a 100 years project to build the Great Walls of China, and it was a project for the nation, and everyone who came into power understood what the mandate was, understood what the vision was, and they kept on doing what they had to do. If we had those same ideas on the African continent, it's going to help us achieve that. If this system where you have somebody who comes into power today, like in the case of Nigeria, APC comes into power, and then they have certain gains, and then PDP comes into power, and they destroy those gains, that is basically trash. The people suffer, the nation's growth is stunted, because then we are trying to be able to create ourselves as celebrities, and then basically say, you know what, we are for the people, we're doing everything that we have to do for the people, this is for the people. No, you're not for the people, you're for your egos, you're for your self-centeredness, and you're for your political party. No political party on the continent of Africa should be bigger than the country itself. And in that regard, we must be able to make sure that we have long-term strategy, long-term mindset, and that long-term mindset on the continent of Africa must have some kind of a communist idea enshrined into it, without which a capitalist, a free market, and a democratic only alone mindset will not be able to help us achieve that. Why is it that on the continent of Africa we cannot become like a place like Dubai? Because obviously if you look at Dubai, their system is quite different, and we can be able to enshrine that kind of system on the continent of Africa. We have all the resources, we have everything that it takes. I think that this whole entire idea of democracy is overrated, and frankly speaking, we have tried this nonsense for the last 60 years. It hasn't worked. Maybe we try something different.
Indeed, you mentioned something about follow-ups within leadership on the African continent, and this is a statement that resonates with what one of the candidates in Ghana, John Mahama, had stated, that it was necessary. He did that in the course of an interview a long time ago, where he was stating that it was imperative for African leaders to be able to initiate some sort of follow-up development plans, so the gains that are made by a government and power are not being eroded by the next set that come into leadership. Now, away from that, Dr. FONGOD, you are an economist within the African continent and on global affairs. Now, in that regard, when you look at countries like the countries in the Alliance of Sahel states, you have earlier on cited that these countries are doing well in terms of their economic growth. And we have other countries within the African continent that are thriving in that light. But do you believe that military rule, we might not advocate for military takeovers, eroding all the gains made by democracy on the African continent, but will you share the same opinion that to some extent military takeovers could bring about some sort of gains in of course, taking the African economic trajectory to another level?
Okay, so if you're talking about economic gains made by democracy on the continent of Africa, I would wait. Maybe someone needs to start listing them to me, because I'm a little bit too ignorant to even understand that. Actually,
Dr. FONGOD, I was asking the feasibility of military takeovers bringing about, democratic or economic gains to the African continents. I was actually citing that we might not advocate for, military takeovers, eroding the gains of democracy within Africa, but I was asking to what extent can military takeovers bring about, take the African trajectory, economic trajectory to another level?
Well, when we start talking about military takeovers, then the very question of democracy goes dead. There is nothing to be said about, democracy so far as military takeovers are concerned.
Yes.
The issue is, are we looking at military takeovers and saying to ourselves that we are doing some kind of a comparative analysis to see which one is better? And I will always state that when the people in a particular country that are ruled by men in uniform are at peace, then you know that whoever was there before basically messed up. When the people who are in uniform are in power and they start their guns and everyone is celebrating and hailing them, and then you look at whatever is happening, especially when it comes to its economic outlook, and then you say to yourself, a country that was basically at the bottom of all economic indexes, it's now, 7th in the world and 1st in Africa in terms of its outlook, in terms of its growth, then you know that whatever those guys in uniforms are doing is absolutely working. My point is, we have to be able to find ways in which we stop talking about having democratic institutions that is not working for the people, because this whatever we call democracy is not for pigs. We are not having democracies for orangutans. This is not for the safari. All right, this is not for giraffes. This is for human beings. And if this democracy is not working for us as a people, why do we keep talking about democracy when in itself it absolutely has given the African nothing? Democracy has taken almost all the mineral resources that we have in Africa out of the continent and then left most of our lands totally inhabitable, and we can't even farm on the land long after the mining companies have left the continent. Democracy has brought pharmaceutical companies into the continent of Africa that has used us as guinea pigs to try all kinds of medications that they are trying to invent for the West, and at the end it has injured and many people have died on the continent of Africa as a result of that. Democracy has basically unseated so many people in power on the continent of Africa that were Pan-Africans with a Pan-African mindset that was out to help us as a people, develop us and push us to where we're supposed to be. That's what democracy has done. Democracy has come on the continent of Africa to basically destabilize our cultures, our values, our norms, bring in whatever they call the transgender movement, just because we are trying to talk about equity and equality, but yet we are talking about equality, not understanding that on the African continent we are more likely to talk, and we love equality of competence, not equality of outcome. You cannot bring a Western construct on the continent of Africa and then you push that construct on our necks, and then once we the people say no, which is basically what democracy is all about, is because it's all about the people. Let the people decide who wants to rule them. I don't care if the whole entire continent is ruled by one man. Bring Idi Amin Dada to power. If the people are happy, and if the nations are become prosperous, and if the ideas and the aspirations of the people are being heard, if the nation basically grows, we have roads, we have electricity, we have water, we have robust agricultural systems, we have good things happening for the people, then that's okay. I don't care if it's Idi Amin Dada. The worst thing is for us to have some puppet out there who has no idea about what they have to do for the people, who is being controlled by the West at the expense of the people of the country dying. We have experienced this for a few decades on most African countries you can look at. Tell me which African country on the continent of Africa has literally experienced any kind of financial breakthrough in the last 60 years. Which? None. Absolutely none. The amount of natural resources we have does not equate to the economic outlook that we have. None. We are still at the bottom of the economic barrel. But we are still pushing to talk about democracy. Now, maybe if somebody in uniform will have to show up and then help us maybe have a little bit of common sense as to what we need to do, and then do what we need to do, that will become better. I quote this as an example. Niger. Before the military took over in Niger, the prices of uranium was basically about 79 cents, or whatever number was, as opposed to the $200-300 in the war market. And France was looting the nation. Meanwhile, there was a guy in power called Bazoum who sat just basically looking at things and obviously looking at his own personal interest, and he was there totally handicapped, not able to do anything. Bazoum is taken out, and now these guys are like, wait a minute, how much do you say this thing again? But why are they selling it for this when the world market is this? And then every single thing else changes. Now, the outlook of the country is absolutely looking good. Now, they have a lot of money to invest in infrastructure. They have a lot of money to put in healthcare. The problem is, to most Africans, is we have been taught that somehow free aid is what builds a nation. Free aid has never built any nation, period. We need to be able to build up a capitalist system that will allow us to be able to bring young entrepreneurs into the market space and allow them to thrive. Innovations, great ideas, and bring capital for young people to get into agriculture, whatever stuff they want to get into, not to sit over there and be hoping for foreign aid coming from some nation at the expense of our people. That's pure garbage.
Indeed, Dr. FONGOD, but I believe you share the same opinion as myself, that we equally have other countries. We'd like to start Rwanda with President Paul Kagame in terms of the economic outlook, given that the country, despite its challenges, stands to be one of the best in the East African sub-region. But away from that, Chief MUSI, you're equally a traditional authority. It's no secret that this erosion of democratic support within the continent of Africa are many times tied to dissatisfaction in governance. Do you believe that this can actually be revived within the context of the African continent?
It can be revived, but not when the country is losing a lot. Not when the country, I mean, we're actually on this show and talking, and there are lots and lots of gun battles out there, like here in Bamenda here. We are talking, and there's a serious gun exchange going on right now to let you understand the kind of fragile environment where we live. You know, when Dr. Mengo was talking, I was just listening, but to the sounds of the guns from the other side, you know. But again, let's come back to the show. Now, the issue is when you look at what our leaders are doing in Africa, there is nothing short of the fact. Dr. Mengon mentioned a point that our economies are dying down seriously because of the leaders the people who are into leadership. And I just want to attest to that by saying that in as much as we keep having the wrong people ruling us, in as much as we do not give the right to democracy to the people, to be able to stand, benefit from their votes, benefit from their rights to vote, at the end of the day, we will still keep having the same problem over and over. Reasons being that most of the leaders that are in government still do not allow the right of the majority to prevail. And as much as that continues, the military keeps taking over. And once the military takes over, there is that support for the military to continue to be at the helm. But as a traditional ruler, I think it is important for us to actually look at excuse me. It's important for us to actually look at the fact that most of our countries need to practice democracy. Most of our governments need to be able to understand what the military takeovers mean, because most of these military takeovers is a means to an end. It satisfies the masses, and what ends up is that they are always comfortable. I'm still to see a military takeover where at the end of the day, they are highly criticized more than the democratic governments that existed as institutions. So I'm still very comfortable to say that while we are striving to have better democratic structures within our countries, we should still think that it is important, it is very important to understand why the military is taking over. One of the things we must assure when military governments take over is we must assure the fact that these governments, this military rule looks at the rule of law, which is what the law should be and what should be practiced, both at the level of higher government institutions. We need to look at human rights. That's the rights of the people, if their rights are being respected in as much as it's a military rule. We also need to look at the well-being of citizens, as Dr. Mengo rightly emphasized. Basic medical height facilities, taxes are low on government, and also basic commodities and fuel prices, and also enough food to feed the masses. When most of these things are well catered for, democracy becomes a game for politicians to exchange words, play with their minds, and then live their life, but not at the expense of the civilians. And again, one other thing I must say is that in as much as we look at democracy as a better form of government, we must look at these key points. Elections are well carried on with the right of the people, the right decisions being taken, the right people who merit being in power, the votes are given to the rightful persons. We must also look that people have the right to protest. Freedom of speech is guaranteed for the masses, and of course, the rule of law. So in one thing here that stands out between democratic structures and military takeovers is the rule of law. Is the rule of law being respected? Now, this comes back to tie with what Dr. Mengot said, that in most of our governments, we must put in place laws that are favorable to the masses and not laws that are favorable to the leaders. And these laws are favorable to the leaders because they are being pushed into power by the Western colonizers, who give them the right to act because of the draining of their economies to the West. And at the end of the day, the masses who own these economies and who own these raw materials are the ones suffering. So in as much as we talk about military coups and military takeover, in as much as we want to talk about democratic principles and the rule, it ends up with the rule of law. Let everyone has a right to his decision, and let everyone has a right to enjoy his or her reason or his or her statesmanship. And well, not far from anything that we have not talked about is the fact that African leaders should keep copying from examples of countries like Ghana and seeing how they can make it better, because we kept crying as Pan-Africanists that the best thing that can happen to Africa is for Africans to adopt a law, adopt a strategy, adopt a system of governance that works best for Africa as a continent. And like he said, he doesn't mind who sits there. Who cares? I don't mind who sits there. But I think the main important thing that we are all accepting on this show is that the right of the majority, the right of the civilians are being catered for, and to a better advantage, and for them to enjoy their rights as citizens of their country. Thank you.
Thank you to Chief MUSI. Just to note that it's left in the hands of Africans to make that decision. Just to move forward with you, Dr. FONGOD, citing Nigeria, which you had earlier on mentioned, the worrying trend of this declining faith in democracy across Africa, it's evident in the country. And of course, pundits would liken this to have more than just economic implications. Do you believe that some of these economic implications of, say, the loss of faith in democracy could be corrected within the context of the African continent?
It could be corrected. If you ask anyone in Nigeria about government, they would tell you government has failed. And the reason why they're telling you government has failed is not because they understand any of the intricacies and the complications and all the issues that arises when you run a very big and large machine like the federal government of Nigeria. They don't understand that, and they don't need to understand that. The only thing that is of value to them is the prices of things. They're asking themselves, why is it that there is massive inflation? Why is it that prices of every single thing has gone up? They are trying to be able to see how they could help themselves. People are getting out of the major cities and returning back to their villages just because they can't take it anymore. So if you're going to ask them, they will tell you that is the only way in which they're able to measure the successes, or the gains that has been made by any government. They want to know that they have the capacity to take care of their basic needs, and this is where the Human Development Index comes in, where we are able to see how happy are the people in any of this economy, and that is in direct coalition with what the democracies that we are trying to push on the continent of Africa. I grew up in Cameroon, and in the 1980s, my dad would tell me that he was going to Yaoundé to go and collect arrears because obviously somehow the government was not producing enough money to be able to pay them. So this was in the 1980s, and as we speak, still to date, they are still having issues handling anything correctly. So which means that if you were going to measure what is the rate of happiness of the people within that country in relationship to, basic stuff, they will still tell you that they are totally not happy at all. It doesn't matter what the GDP says. The GDP does not say anything about the Human Development Index. It might be a component, but it does not address it at all. So we have to be able to start asking ourselves real questions, legitimate questions on the continent of Africa. Should we stand for Western democracy, or should we have a hybrid system? Should we import a little bit of what is happening in the East and then bring that onto the African context, or should we just stick with whatever the West has told us that we should stick with? And secondly, why don't we as a people, with our own minds, with our own ideas, with our own cultures and values and norms as a people, decide what is it that is good for us as a people? Whenever I hear the word democracy, I see the next thing that comes to my mind is colonialism. The next thing that comes to my mind is, a colonial taskmaster. It is slavery. It is somebody telling you what to do because you're subhuman, because you do not have the capacity to think for yourself. That is some kind of a brainwashing system. I think that we need to have think tanks on the continent of Africa, people who can sit down and dedicate at least 5 to 6 years of their lives to study and then basically do a little bit more research to find out what can actually work for us as a people on the continent of Africa. I think that the African Union should literally create a body that sits down to figure out which type of a democratic institution, because it has to have some form of democracy, to actually work anyway, which type should work for us as a people, and how we can be able to include our traditional leaders, because those are the pillars of our cultures, the pillars of our community. If we do not include them, if we do not bring them into this process, we will just be wasting time. I think that time has come for us to basically have this hybrid system, have this conversation towards a hybrid system, rather than just sitting over there and try to please Washington, or show up in New York and go to the United Nations and give a speech as dumb as anything else, just because we are talking, but not understanding that we are speaking on a broken system that has been broken, for more than a generation. We need to be able to make sure that we fully understand what is it that works for the African, and let the African tell us what they're looking for. With that, which I think that the idea of trying to be able to strengthen up democratic institution on the continent of Africa is going to push us to the next 50 years, to when we will be 100 years in terms of when we fully started practicing democracy on the continent of Africa. But the outcome of that will be that development on the African continent will be fully stunted. We will still be going through what we are going through now, and nothing would have changed. I think there's a definition for insanity which says that if you continue doing the same thing that you've done and that you have always done, and you keep doing it that way, and you're expecting a change, it says then you're insane. You got to change something if you're willing to see some change happen. Those boys in the Sahel decided for a change, and good luck to them. They are seeing some legitimate gains being made.
Thank you immensely, Dr. Stanley FONGOD. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, we should reiterate that you are on to 4U Media Africa, and the program streaming live is Talking Point. Meanwhile, you're watching us on 4U Television, listening to us over the airways of FM 96.3 4U Radio, and of course, we are streaming live on our social media platforms, respectively Facebook and YouTube. Now, to proceed with you, Chief MUSI, you listened to your co-panelists, and I would like to add my voice to what he said in relation to what a Ghanaian politician had stated, which I would like to quote, which he made the statement in mid-August 2024, citing that democracy's survival depends on the accountability of political elites within a certain country. Now, with that on the African continent, you have cited earlier that Africa needs to take its own future into its own hands if it wants to take the continent forward. So, in your own opinion, could you kind of cite some of the democratic gains that Africa has recorded up to this date?
I think what they have done, there are institutions within government like their parliaments, their senates. These are gains to be able to have instituted these structures within government. These structures really are not, they have no direct influence as to the West, but the leaders in power who consolidate power, they dictate to these institutions. So just having the Senate, having the parliament, and having local governance, it's a good thing. What the government of Cameroon presently is trying to set up at the level of the regions, you know, giving power back to the mayors, giving power to the elected mayors and all of that, it's a good thing, but they're using the wrong strategy in implementing it. And I think it is important that we highlight that these are positive gains that governments are instituting, but we are looking at implementation phase, the implementation phase. So we are having a wrong implementation phase for a right system of governance. Because if we work with our elected representatives from the local level, from the divisional level, right up to the Senate, to the Parliament, and to the Senate, and then these elected representatives, if truly they were elected and given the right to their votes by allowing local structures count votes and proclaim results, and then we will be a step towards enforcing democracy and institutionalizing democracy within an African system. So what I'm advising here, which I think it's more practical for African leaders and for us Africans, is that we should bring back power to the grassroots. We should start from the auxiliary of government, who are the traditional rulers, who are the direct representative of the people. Exactly. These are the people that the masses pay direct allegiance to, based on their background, even before colonization, which was their culture. You need to know how much respect a person from my village will attach or will pay to me than the kind of respect you will pay to an outsider. And considering that Cameroon has more than 256 ethnic groups, these different ethnic groups by default has more than 256 traditional rulers. The question I'm asking to governments or to the government of Cameroon, how have they used these powers that these traditional rulers have, which is a direct one-on-one relationship with their people, in enforcing democratic values? Let me give them an answer and a proposal. They should, in the course of organizing elections, allow each local polling station, each local institution to monitor, control their elections, declare the results of the elections, and send results to the electoral body. Not the other way around, that these elections are monitored by some representatives in court from government, who in turn sends these results to the elections body. These results are sent to the courts, to the judiciary, who later on proclaim these results. This is how, in the course of moving from these different stages, information is sorted. And it's just like sitting in a classroom. You remember when we're in school, a teacher will come to tell you how communication is so bad when it's not public communication. The teacher will come to your ear, say something to you, and by the time you send that same information around the classroom and it gets to the teacher, it's a distorted information. So once we start taking the rights of the people from where their rights were portrayed, from the ballot box, from the region, from the division, from the subdivision where their ballots were casted, and going through stages, by the time they get to the rightful person who announces it, the results are completely distorted. So I still think that if democracy has to come back to Africa, let the rule of the local population, let the rule of the chiefs in the villages, let the rule of the people who are the direct stakeholders of democracy, which is through election, be given to them and taken them seriously. Otherwise, we will still be dancing the same dance and still singing the same song when time comes for our leaders or for the military to take over power in Africa. Thank you.
Exactly, Chief MUSI, and of course, onto a question which your co-panelist, Dr. FONGOD, had earlier on highlighted. He mentioned that it's actually in the hands of Africans to decide what they want, and I'll be asking that question. Speaking of what African wants, paradoxically, you've seen that the countries that are under military rule on the African continent stand to be growing in terms of their strength in military leadership. You've seen them, especially citing countries like Niger. Their economic outlook seems to be way better than it was under democratic governments. Now, could we say that these two phenomena, these two concepts, can actually be juxtaposed, could actually align side by side within the context of the African continent?
They can only be aligned side by side if the military, if the defense is completely cut off from our government. This is where the problem is, Sharon. The government hold control over the military. They have full control over the military.
And as such, the military is not independent.
You are the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So why would you not consolidate power? It doesn't work. These two systems can work perfectly well, but the defense should be detached from the government. They should be completely detached from the government and function as an entity on its own. Because the use of the defense within every government structure is the determinant of the population. Where there is upheavals, the military should be able to come in and create a balance and make sure that society moves within the rule of law. That's why they are called law enforcement officers. But at the end of the day, the government cannot be structures of governance who have the law, who have the judiciary, and then the military, that is a stronger arm of government, is still under the government. At the end of the day, how do you have these two structures work together? So in effect, what I can say is if it has to work for Africa, Africa should be united. Africa should be united, have one common law, and then the military junctures, the military structures, the military organs in Africa should create a stronger African Union like the Security Council that governs Africa from a military perspective, and they will be able to set rules that do not allow certain military personnel or military as a whole to be able to interfere in a civilian role or in democratic values. And then when all other African countries form a coalition where they have a united Africa, where they have democratic laws that are practiced across the continent, at the end of the day, we will greatly see a transition line between democracy and the role of the military. But if we keep holding on, centralizing power as governments and being heads of commander-in-chief of the military, commanders of the, we will never get out of it. And there will always be that day when there will be that person who will rise up and say enough is enough for the interest of their own people, not for their individual interests. And if in all the military rules that have been to the interest of individuals who take over power, it has always failed with the killing of these military rulers. But if you look at cases where they are satisfying their masses, the masses keep believing in them, and the masses keep thinking that this is the best form of governance. There will come a time when we will ask Africans to vote if they want military to coordinate their electoral processes or they want government. That is when you will understand that military rule has a place in democracy, not only democracy having powers over military rule.
Exactly, Chief MUSI. But then, when you look at the context of the African continent, I believe that you would be advocating for the statement which was made by Pierre Lumumba that stated that the judiciary should be independent. But today, you're citing equally that the military, if it wants to, a country wants to have democratic gains, the military as well needs to be independent, to be cut off from, the government, so that it doesn't, the government doesn't get to consolidate power, and that gets to the impact gets to be felt on the population. Now, from your analysis, do you believe that democracy is indeed justified within the context of the African continent?
It's not a fact. Reason why I say it's not a fact is because it's still being practiced.
Exactly.
And because it's still being practiced, I still don't think it's a fact, because at the end of the day, countries are moving forward.
Exactly, absolutely.
Governments are in and governments are going. There are other days that people will get up to say, we like what happened in terms of the democratic process. And there are days that the civilians will still say, we don't like it. But the majority of it is that oftentimes, within many African countries, the role of democracy has never been given its place. And like we said earlier, it is not democracy that's being practiced in Africa. It's the role of the Constitution. And then once we are able to understand in every argument we have about democracy that it is constitutional governance, and then we will know that democracy has its place and democracy must continue to flourish. But this is always under constitutional governance. So we have to define what democracy truly is if we have to move forward, and then we fit it within this African nomenclature of constitutional democracy. And then from there, we'll be able to start saying we are practicing democracy. But for now, let me be honest with you, there is no practical democracy to rate it. 1/3 of Africa is still not practicing democracy. I don't want to talk about the world because I'm not very conversant with it, but as a Pan-Africanist, I think African democracy is still very underrated. And we need to redefine what democracy is and what constitutional governance is. Thank you.
And of course, that will suit the context in which the concept actually finds itself. Now, to wrap up today's edition with you, Chief MUSI, now speaking of taking Africa forward, charting the way forward for the continent in terms of its progress as well as prosperity, given that Africa has for a very long time been advocating for a united African continent. What do you believe is the right frame or the right solution to take the continent forward, in as much as we have these issues of democratic or better still military governments within the African continent?
The simplest thing to take Africa forward, which I have always emphasized, is that we need to understand that when the civilians who are the benefactors of every state amenity benefit from these structures or benefit from these from the fallouts of their state amenities, and then we are giving Africans their rightful place that they deserve. There is the rule of leadership. There is the rule of governance. There is a civilian role. There is a rule, the rights of the people, their human and legal rights. They have it. You cannot take it away from the people. When once their own individual human rights are being jeopardized, it swells the entire system. That is why I would think that the way forward for Africa, the way forward for our democracy to flourish, is for the people, the masses, the civilians, to be able to benefit from low taxes, because all of this ends with the exportation of their raw materials to the West, in terms of saying that the rightful people are in democratic position or are in government. Their raw materials are being exported at the cost of democracy, of trying to implement democracy. And that is why, with the coming of military rule, when they take over, they start using arms, they start using military gears, and all of these military gears are still being exchanged with the Western world for money. And this money, again, still comes from the taxpayers' money. It still comes from our raw materials that is being exchanged by the West. For the politicians, they come into power. For democracy to be practiced, they have to cede certain percentages of their raw materials to the West. So at the end of the day, what are we saying? All, be it governance, democracy or constitutional governance, be it military rule, they are eating and wasting our raw materials in Africa. So while doing that, they should spend more energy in making sure that Africans have benefits in terms of low taxes, good health infrastructures, good school amenities, good roads, water taxes down, and all of these health bills, subsidies on health bills, subsidies on government taxes. Once the civilians enjoy these, their legal benefits, their rightful benefits as states may, they have nothing to do with politics.
because democracy is all about political gains. Military rule is all about suppression, it's about dictatorship, it's about authoritarian rule, and at the end of the day, the people who suffer are the masses. Give to the masses what they deserve. Give them the good roads, give them good housing infrastructure, give them good schooling amenities, give them good taxes, basic goods and commodities, farm-to-market roads, and when all these things are provided to the masses, and give them the right to protest when they think that they are not benefiting what they are supposed to benefit. That is their civic right. When these things are given to them, you politicians go ahead and practice your thing that you so-called democracy. Who cares about that? But I think at the end of the day, when they will go to the ballot box and they are benefiting from what is being given to them, they'll be able to vote and you'll be able to count the elections with a clean heart without necessarily having to cheat, because they are voting for what they like best. And that is the rule of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you to Chief MUSI WAAMUWURE, who joined us here all the way from Cameroon in your capacity as a traditional chief and, of course, as a Pan-Africanist. Thank you immensely, sir, for taking our time to be with us this day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Meanwhile, we equally acknowledge the brilliant contribution of Dr. Stanley FONGOD, Pan-Africanist and economist, who joined us all the way from the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, today, in the course of today's edition, we were decrypting a statement made by the Ghanaian President Akufo-Addo as far as democracy and military rule on the continent is concerned, where he asserted that African countries should prioritize democracy over military rule. And of course, we believe you learned a lot from today's conversation. I've been NJIX and NABESEH for presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Talking Point. I will leave you in company of our numerous programs. Bye-bye.